Hello, and good morning if you're just joining us. My name's Paul Bergin, and you're witnessing a monthly discussion that I usually have, although the last one I had with Andrew was over 2 weeks ago, on various political events. Sorry, background noise, hang on. And we will be discussing the post-election, having a post-election discussion, sorry, get my brain into gear. With the local elections, the Scottish and Welsh elections, and the mayoral elections. And I'm just doing a bit of very quick housekeeping. And then, hang on. What's going on here? No. This is not what I want. It's as if. Let's try again. Sorry, something's not been updated, and it needs to be updated very, very quickly. Relief. And with 1 minute to go as well. And here we go. And I will bring Andrew into the room, and we'll be able to. Here we go. Right. Morning, Andrew.
Hello, Paul.
Hi, how's things?
Okay, thank you.
I've done a brief introduction while setting everything up about our discussion this morning. So, in short, what did you make of it?
Well, it was an election of three different sorts, maybe more, but I'll just focus on three. One is that in Scotland, the SNP are still very much the dominant party. I think they won 85% of the first past the post constituencies for the Scottish Parliament. And in coalition with the Greens, of course, they're going to form a new administration. They're just one seat short. So the SNP are still as strong as they ever have been in Scotland. Because of South Wales and the various Clwyd seats in the northeast of Wales, Labour is still very much the dominant party in Wales. That hasn't changed. And then in England, well, it's the Conservative Party that is storming to victory in places that you would never have thought a few years ago. I mean, I'll give you an example here. I've got a few figures written down. Although Sunderland City Council is still a Labour-run majority council, in 2016 they had 67 seats. That went down to 61 in 2018, 51 in 2019, and now 42 in 2021. The support is crumbling away. We're not talking about cliff edge stuff here, but it is crumbling away. And I'm looking at the results of various English councils. You can see that. And we haven't even spoken about the Hartlepool by-election, which I'm sure we will. And also, I'll declare an interest. Ben Houchin, the Tees Valley mayor, I've been good friends with him for many years, but I mean, he got 72.8% of the popular vote in an area that just 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, no one ever thought would elect a Conservative. So it's good for the Conservatives in England, great for the SNP in Scotland, great for Labour in Wales. But elsewhere, when you look at an electoral map of Britain, certainly for the parliamentary constituencies, what you see is pockets of support in various big cities around the country. And that's about it. And even that support in those bigger cities is falling away.
That said, and I'm not disagreeing with you, it is a strange election in that it's balanced out with some quite interesting results. I mean, David Cameron now lives in a Labour ward.
Indeed, there's always those, I suppose.
And I mean, Chippy Norton's turned Labour and Woodstock. And I remember some years ago looking at the history of the town of Woodstock. It's been conservative from, you know, even in the time of Disraeli onwards, and yet they've gone Liberal Democrat.
Yes, I mean Cambridgeshire. I think has that gone to no overall control? I can't remember.
Yes, it has.
But then it's hardly surprising. It was a big Remain area, and people are still sort of voting on that Remain Brexit divide. There is still a lot of that. I mean, I think we can't deny it. I'm not saying it's going to, you know, factor into everyone's thinking, because it won't, but I think it factors into the thinking of a sufficient amount of people to actually make a difference.
So you would put that as the main reason as to why in some of the home counties and Cotswolds areas, etc., it's places that you would think if a dog could vote, they would vote Conservative. It's gone.
Well, indeed, if a dog was a candidate, they probably would have voted Conservative. But I think that's the reason why, because it seems to be building a trend. And in those strong Remain areas in the home counties, traditionally, as you've said, very strong Conservative areas, some of them we've had some strange results. Yes, I mean, without a doubt. But, you know, just because David Cameron's ward is now Labour doesn't mean that Labour have suddenly got a great electoral success on their hands.
No, and I would be among if anyone said, "Oh, Labour are coasting on simply on those results," I would have a few quick, sharp words about that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that leads onwards to where Labour is at the moment, especially with the shadow cabinet reshuffle last night, which I thought was a bizarre day of the week and a bizarre time of a day of the week to have an announcement of one. I had planned to blog about it yesterday, and about 11 p.m. last night, I was feeling dog tired, trying to get all the info out. But what did you make of it? And what do you make of where Labour is right now?
Well, dealing with the reshuffle, I mean, what reshuffle? I mean, it's not a case of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It's sort of moving them to slightly different places, but not very far away from where they were before. I mean, Annalise Dodds, I don't think she's been a good performer as Shadow Chancellor. So, I mean, you know, you could argue that she probably would have been reshuffled anyway, but now she's gone to party chair and she's going to be in charge of campaigns. Angela Rayner, although she's lost those sort of roles, Annalise Dodds is going to be strategic thinking, I think it is, because somebody else has gone on campaigns. But Angela Rayner has been removed from her roles, but she's had another one added to them. So she's got this bizarrely long title, hasn't she? As Shadow First Secretary of State, Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Shadow something else. So she's still got an important brief on the front bench. I mean, Nick Brown going. I mean, I don't think it was Nick Brown's fault. Valerie Vaz being fired. Well, it's hardly Valerie Vaz's fault as to what has gone on. And everyone else seems to have, you know, remained the same, apart from one or two exceptions. Now, Rachel Reeves will annoy the left of the Labour Party, the Corbynistas. Now she's been put in this Shadow Chancellor role. But in all fairness, I mean, she does have qualifications. She was an economist for the Bank of England, and I discovered when I was looking her up yesterday, she also worked as an economist in the British Embassy in Washington. So, you know, she does have an economics background. So, I mean, I really don't think that it's if Keir Starmer wanted a big impact from his reshuffle, if you want to call it a reshuffle, it's just moving a few people around, really. Then he hasn't got that impact. As to where Labour is now, well, I'm honestly, and this is not party political or anything, but when I see a party that has lost 4 general elections in a row, after 11 years of a Conservative-run government or a Conservative majority government at various times, they can't hold on to a seat in a traditional heartland in the northeast of England. When I see support crumbling away in those traditional heartlands, Durham County Council, for example, is now under no overall control. For the first time in 100 years, Labour has not run that council. The Police and Crime Commissioner election in Durham was interesting. It went to second preference votes, and the Labour Party candidate squeezed through by about 3,000. When I look at North East Lincolnshire, where Labour has been just about wiped out, I mean, what they're on now, 8 councillors now. You go back a few years ago, they were on 25 and in control of the council. When I look at all those different areas, I think Labour is really one big electoral defeat away from oblivion.
Well, I mean, I have several lands. I can see exactly where you're coming from, and I get the logic. I have some. I'm a bit glass or even half cup full at the moment. That's not saying that I'm not unhappy with the results. I am, or that I'm unhappy with some aspects of the shadow cabinet reshuffle. I am unhappy with some of them. It should have been a bit more wide ranging. There are plenty of opportunistic cheerleaders under Corbyn who are still on the front bench, who I think he would do no harm in sacking. I don't think there would be any damage in sacking Emily Thornberry and Andy MacDonald, for example. Two people who I've been very vocal about. I am not happy with them being where they are. I do think with Annalise Dodds, it's slightly compounded by the fact that I know Annalise Dodds. I actually first met her nearly 20 years ago now, good God. And we're both delegates at the 2004 Labour Party conference, and we were sitting next to each other. And she struck me then as a very sharp cookie. And I think it's very good to put her in Labour, from my first-hand experience of having known her. Putting her as Labour Party chair, not in charge of campaigning, but in charge of thinking, I think it is a good move. As you said, with the Rachel Reeves as Shadow Chancellor, that is a very good move. But it's like it's been one or two good moves and 3 or 4 bad moves. Angela Rayner, I think he was right to do what he did. It could have been handled better, but there are stories that the news was leaked by Angela Rayner's team, and she really kicked up a row. If you're dropped or you're sidelined in a shadow cabinet at a pivotal moment, as we've had now, you can't afford to get gobby about it. For the sake of, your own career and the party, you will not be thanked. There are moments when that's allowable, like say during the Corbyn years when things were so particularly desperate, it was almost like no other option. Now, this is where I feel where I'm slightly glass or cup half full. I would have felt as you did, had Keir Starmer not been elected, they still went on the Corbyn route very firmly, and we had these elections. In fact, the results then would probably have been worse. And then I would have been in deep despair. But this is part of the problem. Labour faced the same existential crisis to a certain extent in 2015 as they did now, and they knew the party had to change direction in some way, and they foolishly chose Corbyn. Someone should have, on the centre or the right party, should have had the guts to stand and brought the party in a fresh direction, and they didn't. And there was a vacuum, and the hard left took advantage. I do feel Labour is now starting on the road to recovery. But as we know from the 1980s, once you start on that road to recovery, it takes a very, very, very long while before you see any results. You've got to regain people's trust. You've got to regain a degree of control of party over the hard left, and that takes some years. You've got to find new and radical ways of thinking and make sure you're 5 minutes ahead of the general public and not 5 minutes behind. and you've got to respect the general public. I will know Labour is firmly on the road to winning a general election when people like Diane Abbott will go on the Today programme and shout their mouths off, or Kim Johnson, Angela Rayner's PPS, who's on News 24, and immediately it'll be on the news that within 6 or 7 hours that the leader of the opposition's office has got in touch and said, we did not give you permission to be on there. Why did you not inform us?
Mm-hmm.
Which is what happened under Blair. When we get see that tight reign over elements of the hard left, and we see there's change, then I will believe that we may be on the road to victory.
It's all about policies, though, that appeal.
It is. But that's going to take time. As I said, that's going to take time.
Yeah, well, yes. Well, yeah. I mean, if you look at the Hartlepool by-election, I mean, for starters, the Labour picked the wrong candidate.
Yeah. This
was a 70% Brexit seat. I think we could safely say that Williams was a Remoaner because he was determined to try and stop Brexit. He lost his seat.
More polite way of putting it.
Well, I don't. What can you? What he was? All right. Well, I won't even use the word. I take away the word Remoaner and just say he was determined to stop Brexit. There, that's because he was. He lost his seat in Stockton South, just 17 months ago. So he was the wrong, and then he had all sorts of problems, didn't he, with some sort of different scandals and things he said on Twitter and social media. I mean, Keir Starmer could have pulled him early on because a lot of this stuff came out very early on, but he didn't. He stuck with the candidate, and we have what we have. So I think the candidate certainly played a big part in the Conservatives having that. The majority of just shy of 7,000. Good healthy majority, especially in a by-election. So, I think there are various reasons at play there, but there is a general trend, even in just that part of the northeast. Because if you look at the northeast of England, Newcastle, Gateshead, South Tyneside, North Tyneside, all those conurbations are still pretty much stuck with the Labour Party. Things haven't changed. Sunderland, as I mentioned, has. But the further south you do go in the region, this is where you're starting to see an array of Conservative seats. The whole of that area has turned blue. You have a Conservative mayor. You've just now got a new Conservative police and crime commissioner who won with, again, no second preference voting there in Teesside, in the Cleveland Constabulary. He won with about 53% of the popular vote. So but this, what I'm trying to say, Paul, is that this hasn't happened overnight. Some of us have been looking at this and have been seeing this happening year after year, and the rot certainly set in pre-Corbyn. And it was there pre-Corbyn. It was accelerated through the Corbyn years. And in all fairness to Keir Starmer, well, he's only been there for just over a year, so it's very difficult to put your stamp on the job, especially during COVID restrictions. And I do understand all of that, but if the reports are to be believed, Keir Starmer really couldn't stamp his authority on the shadow cabinet. He was having people saying no, and he was having to back down. Now, that's not very good. And also, as a new team of leader and deputy leader of the Labour Party, both him and Angela Rayner now seem to be at odds with each other. We're going to see sort of briefings against Starmer, probably very likely. And that's not good because, parties divided don't go on to win general elections.
No, and I accept that. And I actually took the view, and I'd like to be proved wrong. That Keir Starmer will not be the leader who will take Labour into victory because the damage is so much it's going to take a while to get back, rather like in a different way, in admittedly a different personality. Neil Kinnock, the Labour Party for many years owed a debt to Neil Kinnock for helping to make Labour more electable, but he was not the man to bring Labour into government. He just brought it part of the way and for Smith and Blair to finish the job. And maybe that's how Keir Starmer is. As I said, I'd like to be proved wrong. Some of what you've mentioned regarding being out of touch in these areas and being several years, I accept that. it's partly why I said Labour needs to be 5 minutes ahead of the general public, not 5 minutes behind. But it's it's going to have a lot of work cut out. And the reason political parties lose general elections, and sometimes the reason why it takes a while to get back in, is because of a failure to listen to the public and putting one's grassroots before said public, which is always dangerous. But eventually they do recover. I mean, with the Conservatives during the Blair Brown years, there was a problem where the Conservatives were, I think, in many ways out of touch.
I agree with you. I've got to interject there, Paul. If you don't
no,
mind.
it's fine.
It's because after 11 years of a Labour government, had the Crewe and Nantwich by-election after Gwyneth Dunwoody sadly died, and the Conservatives won quite a big victory in the Crewe and Nantwich by-election. And that was as I expected. Nobody really thought after 11 years of the same party in government that incumbent party was going to start winning by-elections, because the political trends show something different. We're now 11 years into sort of conservative run governments. We've had 11 years of conservative prime ministers, and yet Labour doesn't appear to be anywhere near winning.
Part of that problem goes down to, I think, the summer of 2015. Labour was right in knowing that it needed to change direction somewhat. Where it went wrong was they thought the answer was Jeremy Corbyn, which makes me, I think they allowed self-indulgence to get.
And what was the question, really?
That's what I was about to wonder what the question was. I remember well, if you allow me to do some self-indulgent political history here. I remember the election, the aftermath of that fairly well, because my wife Rachel was the Labour candidate for Hitchin and Harpenden. Rachel did very well given the circumstances. She increased Labour's share of the vote by 20% in a very safe Tory area under
Peter Lilly was the MP at the time, wasn't he?
Yes, and Peter Lilly was MP at the time. We knew there was no way there, but we slightly exceeded the expectations we had, and Rachel did incredibly well. And I remember that weekend, and it was one of the most enjoyable weekends I had, probably for Rachel as well, because I mean, if you've done non-stop this, that, and the other campaigning every weekend almost for 18 months, bar family occasions and Christmas, etc., it's quite nice to have a normal weekend. And I remember a friend of Rachel and mine and I, or the three of us, had dinner outside a pub restaurant in Baldock. And we were discussing what the future was. And I remember saying how the party needed to change direction. We need perhaps Dan Jarvis was the answer. And then, of course, Dan Jarvis bottled it. Understandably, in part. Let's be fair. His first wife died in the previous 3 years, and he had small children, and he had just started a serious relationship for the first time. And understandably, there was a lot of emotional upheaval, and he felt that wasn't the right time. And fair credit to that. But I felt we needed someone like that. We needed someone who knew how to speak to people in the north and how to speak to the metropolitan areas of the south, etc., in ways that they all accepted without there being any contradiction. But that's what some are starting to think now. But at the time, they picked Corbyn. And I think that's a lot of Labour's problems 11 years in, is because at a very crucial moment, they made the wrong decision and therefore kept Labour in opposition for perhaps what will turn out to be a further 10, 12 years longer than it would have been.
But it's how long a party can be out of power. I mean, or if we go back to the 19th century, it can be quite a long time. But we're not living in the 19th century. No. I interviewed Lee Anderson, Conservative MP for Ashfield, a few weeks ago, and I mean he was a lifelong Labour man before he joined the Conservatives. And he said he was at a Labour Party meeting in Ashfield, and he was wanting to discuss some of the problems at Ashfield. and instead they were talking about a condolence book, for Venezuela, and one of them said to him, "Have you read Karl Marx?" And he said he turned around. He said, "I think I'm more likely to have read Groucho Marx." He said, "Well, I think you'd be better in the Tories then," and that's when he left and joined the Conservatives.
Yeah.
And so I mean that was all going on, and obviously in the early Corbyn days, but I think it'd been going on for quite a while in some of those places. They're more interested in freeing Palestine and say solidarity with Venezuela and solidarity with just about any country in the world that isn't Britain. And eventually, when that rot sets in, and people can see that their local Labour Party is like that, then of course the voters will eventually reject it.
I don't. I wish I could disagree. I don't. And you'll know exactly what I think of those elements within the Labour Party. But I, at the same time, not wanting to draw a veil over it, but the Conservative Party have their problems and malcontents within their party who are out of touch, who at times dominate the party and shouldn't. Perhaps more rarely, but they do. And part of it, I suppose, is that we're both broad church parties. However, I do think that one can only hope that nature abhors a vacuum. The sort of country we are, we need a strong political opposition. If Labour will not provide it, at some point another party will. But I have, at the moment, given the political system we have, given it the Labour Party is, I'm sure it will be the Labour Party. It's just a question of when rather than if.
Would it be a good idea in certain ways? I mean, if the Labour Party did split, so the hard left went off and did their own thing.
I would be happy if the hard left went off and did their own thing.
Yeah, I was thinking. I mean, because we talk about split, but sometimes splits can be good. Sometimes splits can be useful. There might be a rebranding exercise. Maybe the name of the party does change, but there could be all sorts of possibilities. But as long as the hard left are not as much in control as they were, of course they're not. I mean, Starmer has done a good job in trying to get rid of many of them.
Yeah.
Thus far, but they're still around.
Yeah.
They still have no intention of leaving the Labour Party because they want to reclaim it back again, don't they?
But I think the thing is with the hard left is, well, there's two things. One, I think a lot of them will leave off their own volition, just as some of the Conservatives went off to UKIP or Reform, as it now is, or whatever. As in the reform from Brexit, not reform from UKIP.
Yeah.
But some of them will be forced out because they've overstepped the mark a little bit so obviously that you can pin it on them. Some will be forced out. Some say that perhaps Blair was not tough enough on some parts of the party in the country as he should have been. There was an opportunity in 2001, 2002 to suspend Jeremy Corbyn from the Labour Party because of the amount of times he rebelled as an MP. And Blair overcautiously decided that was not where they were going to go. I get where Blair was coming from, but hindsight's a great thing, and there was a good opportunity there. Also, Labour did very silly things like, and this is usually when they let their guard down. They got having the £2 voting thing during the Miliband era. I mean, we're not the United States in terms of voting, and wanting to do something close to primaries was not good. It's similar to in the early 70s when you just had one or two rotten apples on the NEC and they voted to remove the prescribed lists. So a whole load of the horrors. And these were safeguards put in by the Labour Party to make sure that what we've seen happen didn't happen. I think hopefully, the Labour, and what this is my hope, it's my concern over this that is preventing me from rejoining Labour in part, which is Labour needs to put these safeguards back in, and it needs to be made extremely and explicitly clear these safeguards cannot be moved, and these are the reasons why.
Yeah. You are right. I mean, it was Ed Miliband's fault that, in some ways, it was Miliband's fault that Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, because under the old system it wouldn't have happened. And I mean, you may recall back. I mean, going back nearly 5 years now, but I mean, we met up for a coffee at the Labour.
Yes, I remember that well. Yes,
yeah, in Liverpool, and obviously I was there, covering it. I was writing for websites, and as well as making contacts for the Freedom Association. So very much a working time for me. But I remember, I think it was the same day that I had coffee with you. Later on in the evening, there was a pub just across from the entrance of the. I think there's many pubs and restaurants around there, but just across from the entrance of the conference centre. And I was chatting with some lovely people from the northeast of England, pretty heartbroken. They'd supported Tony Blair and the Labour Party right through all of that, and were proud of what Tony Blair achieved. I mean, I'm not saying that I would be necessarily proud of what Tony Blair achieved, but they were, and they were good, honest, decent people. They were good, honest, decent people who were willing to roll their sleeves up and put in some work, which every party needs. And they just didn't know where they were going. They were literally drowning their sorrows. They just didn't know where they were going because Corbyn had been, re-elected again as the Labour Party leader, and they could see what was happening. But what do you say? The Labour Party, I mean, for starters, I usually have this Union Jack in the background now just to wind people up more than anything else. But because some people do genuinely get wound up by it.
And I have old family photos. But anyway.
Well, I know, but I'm in my office and not in my home. But the reason I say that is because Labour is seen as an unpatriotic party. That was accentuated with Corbyn. I mean, after the poisoning in Salisbury, he was refusing to join the condemnation of Russia, and it was so obvious. I mean, he's a Privy Councillor; he had everything in front of him. It was obvious what had happened. No one was doubting it. No European leader was doubting that Russia was behind it. The United States wasn't doubting that Russia was behind it, and yet Jeremy Corbyn was still trying to refuse to condemn Russia, and that's when I think many ordinary sort of working class people, especially in the North and the Midlands, have just had enough of it. The party's not addressing what matters to me most.
I agree. I mean, I think sometimes there's my wife Rachel is half Northern Irish, and she's used the phrase with some of the problems in Northern Ireland are down to throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The other side do this, so we're not going to do it, and that ends up being a blanket ban on a lot of things, and you can't take that attitude. Sometimes that is the false attitude. I think sometimes there are those in the hard left of the Labour Party have seen the way how patriotism is being hijacked by some on the hard right, and they automatically recoil. Now, obviously, you and I know that it's right to recoil when patriotism is hijacked by the hard right. But the way of dealing with that is not to reject patriotism.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. The Union flag is the flag of our country. It's also used as a trademark. People know when they buy goods without Union Jack stamped on it that it's of a high quality. It's made in Britain. And you're right. Just because the National Front decided to hijack the flag, I mean, it would be a similar sort of thing for unionist parties in Scotland to say, well, I mean, the SNPs hijacked the Saltaire. Yeah, exactly. So therefore, we must reject it. Well, how ludicrous. I don't think any Scot would ever say that. In fact, the Unionist parties are saying no. We got to fly it just as vigorously as them because we're as proud and loyal as Scots as the SNP are. So you are right.
I mean, I do think the patriotism will come back. I mean, it did under Tony Blair with the Cool Britannia thing, and I think it will have to. But I mean, I do think. It, as I said before, with me, it all boils down to a question of timing. And I just wanted a quick change before we go.
Mm.
What did you make of the London mayor elections?
Well, Sean Bailey, I mean, was completely written off. And I've got to admit, I didn't think he was a particularly strong candidate at all. But he came down much closer than anyone thought it was going to, which does make me wonder if the Conservatives have picked a really strong candidate. I'm not saying another Boris, but certainly someone with a lot of charisma, someone who could, was a natural communicator. Whether that could have been different, but I mean, that's just all conjecture, really, isn't it?
It is. It is. I have to confess, being slightly light-hearted here, I was surprised Count Binface didn't get as many votes as I thought he would. I did like about at least 2 points in his manifestos, but perhaps more as a cultural thing rather than enforced in a legislature. But yeah, it's London's always a different one, which is why I asked. But I do think, again, Labour need to keep their eye open on that on London, because sooner or later, the tide can turn, and I just hope that Sadiq Khan is savvy to that.
Well, I mean, if I was living in London and I was looking at the rise in knife crime, for example, um, I'd be asking the mayor, what are you going to do about it? Now, in all fairness, under Boris Johnson in his first term, he brought these things down. They had a tougher approach to it. So the mayor does have a role. It's not just the commissioner of the Met, who, of course, the mayor can fire if necessary. So, I mean, the mayor's got enormous powers there. And we know that Boris Johnson won 2 terms for the Conservatives. And as I say, if you get the right person in there, the Conservatives can do it again in, well, everyone says a traditional Labour city. Well, it is, but as we know, it's a donut. It's red in the middle and it's blue on the outer ring. That's how London is. And it's a matter of, so for the Conservative Party, it's always a matter of finding more votes in inner London rather than outer London, but it can be done. So yeah, I mean, it's whether Sadiq Khan wants to go for a third term. I'm sure he hasn't even thought about that at the moment, just after being elected for a second.
Yeah.
And is this just, I don't know if you know this, is this going to be a 3-year term now? Because he did 5 years to get back into sync again. I know that's happening with the other metro mayors. I got that from an interview with Andy Street.
I wouldn't be surprised either way. I think my gut reaction is 3. And I'm not sure.
I think it is because I said the other metro mayors.
I mean, a lot of things, they're there for a reason. I mean, even outside politics with the Olympics. I mean, they'll have the Olympics in Tokyo later this year, which will be very reduced and not the most memorable for obvious reasons, and no one's fault there. But then, of course, it's still all go for Paris in 2024.
Same with football as well. Same with, the Euros are going to be held this year, and then we're going to go straight into the World Cup. And everything will go back in sync again. Put it that way, So the Euros will be held this year, and then in 3 years' time they'll be held again, as if it's like the regular 4-year cycle. So I think that's probably what's going to happen. So basically, you've got 3 more years of Sadiq Khan as mayor of London based on that, and then he'll have to decide what he's going to do again. Standing for a third term, it gets harder, doesn't it? The more it's great to be re-elected, but when you start going for third terms and fourth terms, unless you're the SNP in Scotland, that's still under different leaders.
I'm no fan of Boris Johnson, but I will give him credit for being canny at times. And I mean, he clearly knew when to jump ship over being London mayor.
Yeah, he did.
And then move on. I'll give even Tony Blair credit in that he knew when to jump. I think part of it might have been he might have held on a bit longer in the hope that there would have been a credible alternative to Gordon Brown in his eyes, because even if he was okay with Gordon Brown, a lot of his supporters wouldn't have been. I would go so far as to say perhaps the Blair Brown feud, if there was a feud, probably was one of the things that allowed the hard left to get in where they did, because they had their eye off the ball. But that's something else. But I do think, so some politicians have a knack of just knowing when to walk.
And of course,
Margaret
Margaret Thatcher didn't. Many of them don't, to be perfectly honest. In all fairness, but yeah, I suppose the American system, presidential system, where if you've served a second consecutive term, that's it, and you can never stand again in your life, saves a few blushes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because would George W. Bush have been elected a third time?
Yeah.
Against Obama, maybe, probably not.
Yeah.
In that respect, it allows people to just to retire with dignity, doesn't it?
Yeah. Talking of which, I see we're coming up to 40 minutes. There are other things to do. I'm very glad to have this discussion, and hope to catch up with you perhaps next month as well at the start of. Hopefully, we'll see how things change in that short time.
Well, we will, although I will give you advance warning that the last Friday in May, I'm halfway down on a journey to Devon, so I won't be around.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
All right.
Bye.